recall the incident myself, but I've seen the reports and not going to argue with that.
He also apologized for any high school hijinks where he might have gone too far. With me to discuss the legal and political angles of this story, Noah Feldman, Bemis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and also a columnist with Bloomberg View, and Richard Socarides, a former LGBT advisor to President Clinton and former president of Equality Matters, who blogged on this story on the New Yorker's website today under the title, "Why Obama Couldn't Wait." Noah, let me start with you. The president, obviously in a very profoundly important personal statement of principle, said he believes in same-sex marriage, but has he ducked the legally important issue by saying, but now I'm leaving it to the states to define what marriage really means?
So far, yes, he is ducking the issue because although it is true that his administration no longer supports the Defense of Marriage Act, which would otherwise require the federal government to recognize marriages performed in states which do allow gay marriage, he still hasn't had to weigh in before the Supreme Court on the big-ticket question, which is whether there's a constitutional right to same-sex marriage. And that issue will eventually come to the court. And when it does, the administration will have to take a stand one way or the other. I mean, they could opt out of it completely, but they probably won't. They'll probably say one way or the other. He hasn't yet committed himself to that question. So
from your perspective, as the legal scholar, the legal historian, is the president still kind of involved in a two-step here, or is he doing something that is as dramatic as the headlines would suggest? Because he still is not confronting what is really, as lawyers and as civil rights advocates would claim, is the fundamental issue. Is there a constitutional right here that he will uphold?
The president keeps on speaking about the evolution of his ideas, and I would say there's still one more tick left in his evolutionary process, because so far he's gone from saying, I don't personally support the right to gay marriage, but states can do what they want, to saying, I do morally support the right to gay marriage, but states can do what they want. And the last little move in his evolution, I suspect, will have to still come, and that will be, I think the Constitution entitles people to a right to gay marriage, which will mean that the states will not be able to do whatever they want. The states will have to do what the Supreme Court says is basic law, the same way that they did when the question of marriage between people of different races was before the Supreme Court. That was a state law issue, too, until the Supreme Court said that everyone has a right to marry everyone else regardless of race. And so eventually, this will not be a state law issue.
That's right. And of course, we know that issue will be presented to the Supreme Court probably not before, certainly not before this November's election, but at some point in whoever the president is in the next presidential term. Richard, let me come to you. Do you think the president should have gone to the next step and said, we are going to federalize this and determine that this is a constitutional right? Or did he sort of do what is reasonable, fair? You give him a pass on his Darwinian evolution. We all know evolution takes time. It takes millennia for species. Is it fair for him to have left this to the states?
Well, you know, I pretty much agree with everything Noah said. I do think, though, that the announcement yesterday was very dramatic and really historic, and I think we should try not to put too fine a point on it. I think given what the president has instructed the Justice Department to do in the sexual orientation discrimination cases, and the Justice Department new policy as of about 2 years ago has been to urge the court to apply a very tough level of scrutiny in those cases. And I think that, you know, when this issue does come before the Supreme Court, given everything we know about where the administration stands on these issues, especially the stance that the Justice Department has taken on these issues, they're gonna have to say to the Supreme Court that there is a federal constitutional right to marriage equality.
So I hear you saying you believe evolution will continue. We have not reached the final stage of evolution here.
I think he's pretty much there. I mean, I really, you know, I've been very tough on the president on this issue,
right,
but I was completely satisfied yesterday, and I had no problem with him saying, you know, I think what he was saying when he talks about this being an issue left to the states, what I think he meant was that usually it's state law that controls who gets a marriage license, like we had here in New York, you know, last June.
Now, one of the things we have perhaps too often forgotten is that the president, maybe this is evolution, there was devolution after 96. Right. In 96, he was very much for it. Then in 04, he was not. But let me sort of ask it this way. Have we not spent the last 3 years cleaning up, in a way, the mess that was created by President Clinton? DOMA, a bill he signed that, of course, violated most of our senses of decency, the Defense of Marriage Act, and also Don't Ask, Don't Tell. President Obama needed to clean up the mess that our last Democratic president created in a perverse sort of way.
I worked for President Clinton.
Right. I don't mean to put you on the spot on this, of
I
course.
would exactly characterize it exactly that way.
But it's kind of true, isn't it?
Well, you know what? Here's the way I try to. I like to look at it, and that is that back in '96 when President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act in the middle of his re-election campaign, his political advisors said it was too risky not to. We all knew that in his heart he didn't want to, but he felt he was forced to for political reasons. But now, because the country has traveled so far and we have traveled so far culturally on these issues, that President Obama was able to take a different stand and actually reject the advice of some of his political advisors. That he was probably getting the same advice that Clinton got, but now he could reject it. So, I give him a lot of credit. I really think it's a profile in courage.
Look, I agree with you. I just want to put this in the historical context.
Absolutely.
No, I want to come back to you for a moment. The legal issue or the sort of philosophical issue that was raised by the president's pastor, will churches be required to recognize marriages which they do not wish, based upon their own doctrine, to recognize? How does the law interface, a word I don't like, with religion in that First Amendment space?
The Constitution guarantees the free exercise of religion, and there is no way that any law passed by anyone in the country, Congress, a state, whomever, can require a church or a synagogue or a mosque to perform a marriage that they do not want to perform. That's an absolute protection under the First Amendment. The part that is not completely ridiculous that the pastor mentioned is that anti-discrimination laws do govern those parts of a church that aren't ministerial, that don't have to do with the clergy themselves or the most crucial clergy-like employees of the religious institution. And in that sphere, it is true that if you imagine a janitor who works for a church who is part of a same-sex couple and is married, the church might have to, under generally available laws, provide health care insurance for the spouse which they couldn't avoid doing without discriminating. It's sort of analogous to the issue between the bishops and the president that's arisen over birth control.
Exactly right. Noah, is this somewhat, the way I describe it to people is that there are two components to religion. One is the civil, where the state, the government gets to define the relationship between people. And then there is also the religious. If people choose to have a religious ceremony, a religious aspect to it as well, that is where church or any denomination can define what the parameters of that marriage may be. And we cannot force a religion to recognize a marriage it does not wish to recognize. But as you point out, somewhat akin to the issue of birth control and the scope of health insurance, we're going to have to figure out how, at certain sort of tertiary levels, spouses will be able or not be able to get birth control or be able to get health care in a marriage that the state recognizes and under law says people have to pay for. Where do you think, Noah, those litigations end up going?
My guess is that we draw a pretty bright line between the people who are doing the religious work in churches and in temples and in mosques and the people who are doing, for lack of a better word, the backroom work, the administrative work. And those who are involved in the religious work of the organization, these churches will not have to provide equal accommodations for. But on the other hand, people who are doing backroom work probably will. And I think the other thing to keep in mind is that, religions exist in a cultural context. And no matter how much they deeply believe their values, those values do sometimes change over time. And so in a cultural sense, the more the country accepts same-sex marriage, the more likely we will be to see some religious denominations, not all, but some, gradually changing their own views on that question.
No, that is certainly the case, although I think it's fair to say the evolution, as it may be within religious denominations, is a bit slower than the evolution that thankfully we're seeing in the political context. Richard, let me come back to you. Obviously, there's a huge political aspect to this. The screaming and shouting the past day has been, does this help or hurt the president? Right. Give us your distillation of all of what you've heard, read, thought. You were in the White House with President Clinton. Does this step help President Obama in some of the swing states, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Colorado, or is this a risk that he is taking?
Well, I think it's very hard to say. I think that it may change the electoral calculation in some places. I mean, obviously, this is kind of a 50-50 issue in the country as a whole, so in some places it's going to be better, in some places it's going to be worse. But I think that where it really helps the president is with young voters, with his Democratic-based voters, and it is totally consistent with the president's message that if you want to go forward, this is an election about the future. He's the candidate of the future. He's the candidate who wants to bring us forward. This is about the future. This issue, Mitt Romney's stand on this issue makes him look kind of like Grandpa. I mean, he's the old guy who doesn't kind of want to get get moving with where the country is headed. It's clear where we're headed on this issue, and Mitt Romney is like,
Look, I think that on a whole range of issues, and of course, it's just me speaking, and folks know where I am politically, the Republican Party is backing itself into being the party of the last century, maybe the 18th century, certainly not the 21st century. Last question, though. Did Joe screw up? was this? I mean, I love him for it. Did Joe just kind of say what was on his mind, and the president said, "Oh my goodness, why'd I pick this guy?" Or was this orchestrated? What's your take on all this?
I don't think it was orchestrated. You know, I think that he probably went a little further than he had permission to go. And you know, there were reports just this afternoon that he's actually apologized to the president for doing it. So, but you know, that's Joe being Joe.
The conspiracy theorists would say even that was orchestrated in order to make it about, you know.
I hadn't thought of that, but that's a good one.
Conspiracies just add the last little contrary fact on to the end of the conspiracy. Anyway, it's all very complicated. Noah Feldman, Bemis Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and columnist of Bloomberg View, and I just want folks to know, one of the smartest lawyers I've ever spoken to, and Richard Socarides, former LGBT advisor to President Clinton, president of Equality Matters. Thank you both for coming on the show tonight.
Thank you, Eliot.
Did I imagine this, or did President Obama completely reform Wall Street a couple years ago? Actually, we all imagined it. There's been no reform. More Viewpoint coming up.